Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Coffee Night Chat, part one of a three-part series on sexual health and wellness, harm reduction techniques, and so much more. My name is Tristan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the president of Pflag Canada York Region. Thank you all for spending some time with us tonight. I'm joined by an amazing person. Their name is Akia. I'm gonna get the, where's my notes here? Disappeared. Here we go. So Akia is a Black, queer, agender human that has been working in harm reduction and social services for 7 years. They like to disrupt heteronormative discourse and believe in disrupting and dismantling the ideology behind prohibition, incarceration, and policing. They have performed as a public speaker in many spaces, including Hot Docs at Ted Rogers and Nuit Blanche. They also started We Grieve Thousands, a protest movement to create space for those who lost loved ones to the opioid epidemic, to bring their grief and rage and call for decriminalization of drugs and policy change. They won LGBT Youth Line's Outstanding Contribution to Health and Social Services Award, and recently their short documentary, Decriminalized Now, Akia's Story, premiered in LA Outfest 2022. Akia, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey, thank you, Tristan. Thank you so much for the intro. Hello, folks. As Tristan said, my name is Akia. I'm really happy to be here. I love the work that Pflag does. So thank you for coming out and supporting and spending a little time with us and sharing some space. So what I wanted to do was have a three-part series to talk about sexual health and queer health trends and the things that affect us. And so what I wanted to do to kick off the series was to start by talking about oppression and power, because these things are really what drive and influence what we do, how we live our lives, because we're living under heteronormativity and we're living under patriarchy. We're living under all these different systems that oppress us and hold us down, and this affects the way that we live our lives. So I wanted to start with oppression and the heavy cost of oppression. So at what cost are we living in society? Well, the way I look at it, the queer community and queer society, it's almost like because we are positioned against a heteronormative straight society, we at times recreate what straight society looks like to overcompensate when we don't need to. And when what we really need to do is resist and live on our own. And so what we do is we replicate the oppression that comes with that into society as it is. And so just going over the different forms of oppression so we can recognize when we're doing it, we can actively resist doing it and actively take a stance against doing it. So we're making sure that we're taking care of our people, we're taking care of our community. So I want to first start off with a land acknowledgement. I personally am currently in my office right now in Newmarket, and it's located on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe Treaty people of Williams Treaties First Nations and other Indigenous peoples. I think that it's important to not be nationalistic as we're on stolen land. So yes, we obviously identify as being Canadian, but it's important for us to think about what that means in the context of being queer and on land that doesn't belong to us, while enjoying living lives of openness and queerness on land that doesn't belong to us. Also, I think it's important to mention that where Two-Spirit identities have been claimed by Indigenous people were forcibly erased by settlers through colonization. And then after that, Two-Spirit identities were assimilated into the Western idea of what queer was and queer is. And all of this happened on land that was stolen by white people. So we have a job as the marginalized groups, as people who are queer and people who are of color, people who are marginalized, people who are poor, people who are displaced, all people on the different margins. But as marginalized people, we have a job and a duty to exist and stand in solidarity with Indigenous folks in terms of land sovereignty, as well as treaty rights and other things that Indigenous folks are fighting for right now. So a little bit about CARE before I start into like the content. So a bit about CARE. Our vision is to create safe and confidential and inclusive spaces and services in York Region where folks can access dignified support and meaningfully engage in self-determined pathways to well-being. We envision an informed, healthy, stigma-free, and compassionate community. We are an ASO, an AIDS service organization that works out of York Region. We've been around for 27 years now, almost 30 years, and we service all of York Region. And so what we do is we try to best serve folks who are living with HIV, who are living with HIV or AIDS. But not only do we serve them, but we serve people who use substances, people who are newly diagnosed and long-term survivors of living with HIV and AIDS, people who are at risk of Hep C and HIV, people who use drugs, people who are two-spirit and queer, and people who are like in general vulnerable and marginalized. We try not to turn anyone away who comes looking for help. We have 4 main programs. So we have a harm reduction program, we have HIV/AIDS support services program, we have a rainbow space program, and we have a Hep C program. Our goals are also to form partnerships for positive change, advocate for meaningful systemic change, and also act in the spirit of community learning, helping, and growing collaboratively. So a few of our values are self-determination and well-being, and they're rooted in the principles of greater and meaningful involvement of people who are living with HIV and AIDS, drug and substance use, as well as QS LGBTQ identified community members, harm reduction, and anti-racism and anti-oppression. Everything that we do is very heavily rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression, which is something that it's really important, especially now, given all like the oppressive legislation that's been being passed recently. So this is a bit of our agenda. So we're just going to talk about power, the characteristics of power, the nature and magnitude of power, what measuring power looks like, how we measure power, privilege, stigma, prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination, microaggression, and other forms of like hate-motivated violence. So we're going to first start with power. So what is power? And why is it important to us? So power is the individual and collective ability to make something happen and or affect change in physical and non-physical ways. Power in a societal context is part of the foundation of all forms of oppression and conflict, and it's key when we're talking about discussing anti-oppression and striving for key change. For the queer community, power and safety are often intertwined, and that's due to the violent nature of queer-related oppression. Some of the most violent crimes are those crimes committed against queer folks. So oftentimes our power is heavily rooted in, how safe we are, how comfortable we are, how free we are of violence. And that tends to be, when you see a queer person that has power, they tend to be safe. Like gender and race, the concept of power is a socially created idea that doesn't have any scientific origin. So power doesn't really technically, it didn't really exist, but it does matter now, but it doesn't really have a scientific basis in existing. It's not a tangible physical thing. It's not like a cup or like a phone. It's like race or gender. It's constructed by society, but it has very real consequences and effects. I see something in the Q&A, so I'm just going to stop and hop in there. And I see a question, and I see the question, Raven, and we're going to get to the questions in a second. Well, at the end, there's a Q&A, so hold that question. I will get to it, and we can also talk about this question. That's a very good question. The question is, does power and safety also affect queer oppression in a multitude of intersectional ways? And we'll get to that. I want to close this. I'm just gonna. One second. There you go. Go back a bit. So power, it is, and thank you for the question, Raven. So power assumes the form of that which will benefit the will of the individual accessing power. So it's derived from what society considers as valuable and of worth. So for example, for cis men, power comes from being masculine and strong, and for cis women, their social power comes from assuming a role that's non-threatening to men because we live in a patriarchal society. Power comes from what the standards are, what norms look like, and how closely a person aligns with the ideals of the dominant group. Power isn't static in nature, so it changes. Power changes in shape, in function, um, and shape, function, and what I was supposed to say was intention. So the intention of power changes. Power doesn't have its own intention. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. Power, the intention of power changes with the will of the person accessing power. As queer men, we immediately have less power than cis men because we're seen as weaker than straight men. When I say cis men, I mean like cis hetero men. I'm just used to saying cis men as like a straight short form, coming from someone who's Black, agender, and queer. We immediately have less power than straight men because we love other men, and like this is seen as a position for women. And then there are some of us that are more feminine, and that strips us of more power. And queer women that are butch tend to face ridicule because they are seen as pretending to be powerful. In different situations, we may have different advantages or influence, but that doesn't change the amount of fundamental power we have. And so what I was trying to illuminate in that passage was that the reasons why we have more or less power changes. So for women who are, for queer women who are more masculine or more butch, and I say masculine with quotations, because that is also an idea that isn't static and changes, because there is no one set way of what being masculine is. They have less power when, as men who are not as masculine, they should have more power because they're acting in a way that's aligned closer to what being male is, which is more dominant, but they have less power. So power doesn't necessarily work in the same ways based on who you are. It changes based on who you are. It changes based on from person to person. It doesn't work in the same way. This is what I was trying to say is that personal access to power is all relative. As queer folks, disparity in power can be stark given the amount of marginalization that exists uh, within to power and organization in the community. How much power you how much power you access and you have is determined by how close you are to certain norms and ideals. Hence, the understanding that people have a proximity to power. So people can't actually hold power. People can be close to it. People can access it, but it's not something that you as one person can hold and say, I have this power. It's something that you tap into. It's something that you can access. It's it's similar to privilege, and it's as almost like a backpack or something that you can equip and wield and put on and use and maneuver in different situations, but it's not something that you consistently have the same amount of in each situation. One queer person can have a large amount of power and their partner can have a minimal amount of power. But oftentimes in the queer community, we pick our partners to attain a greater proximity to power if we're marginalized. And that's not a shady thing to say. It's just to say that our lives are so difficult. And so the ways that we choose to survive sometimes is through having a partner that has more power than we do to help us. And sometimes our partner understands that and they actively leverage that power in order to allow us to access spaces that we might not have access to normally. Your proxy to power is relative to the body you're born in, the perception of your power, the way you act in public, social norms, gender roles, and who is allowed to have and who's deserving of power. So power is heavily influenced by so many different things. It's that very, very much not static. Although power is not based on strength alone, because as I was talking about in my previous slide, it like for cis straight men, power does have a relationship with being physically strong, because that's the heteronormative idea of what being a man is, which is the dominant group in our current paradigm. It can be used in forceful and violent ways that appear nonviolent or non-confrontational, with fatal and devastating consequences. So power can really be can really devastate someone in ways that might not seem devastating. So, for example, the "Don't Say Gay" bill, it might not seem devastating to straight people, because all we're doing is changing certain words and certain course content in a curriculum. But for us, that's erasure. So that's the power that they have, that they wield over us. And so for them, it's not something that seems violent. But for us, it's extremely violent. And so the disparity in which we're affected by power it's vast. It's definitely not something that is, it's not something that's static. It's something that's very varied. And power is universally important. The amount of power you have is in direct relation to how you can shape your life and what you can access socially, like class, education, housing. Power is important. And it also determines how you can seek justice for something wrong that's been done to you, which is why it's so important that marginalized folks have power, because it helps us access justice. This is why when someone acts as if homophobia or racism is not a big deal, they need to understand it's not only about that specific action, but it's about the quality of life that you have, the quality of life that we have, and the control that we have over the life that is subject to the violence and their ideology, and that we can only do so much to protect that because we only have so much power. So that's why for marginalized folks, power is something that's so important. And for people that have power, they might not understand where we're coming from, or why we might feel or seem defensive, or why we might act extremely angry, why we might be possessive of what we have, why we might fight sometimes. It's because of power. It's because we are trying to just protect what we have, and trying not to lose more of what we have. Power is seen on micro level, on interactions on a micro level. So, like for example, asking for an apology and receiving that apology, and also on systemic levels, like the resistance against genocide and colonization. Determining the exact role of power requires situation-specific analysis and consideration of different variables like intersections, social identities, social location, and the forces involved, like oppression, forms of oppression, and privilege. Historically, the desire of those in power run perpendicular to social progress, change, and human rights. People in power just tend to have never wanted what we've wanted. And that's why it's so important that when we get into positions of power, we don't forget where we come from, and we leverage the power that we have to create space for more of us to come through. When an individual or a group are disadvantaged due to the lack of power, they're considered marginalized. Power is a force in a structure or dynamic that can be felt through the passage of time as well. So the feeling of the intergenerational trauma by generations after the 60s scoop, the anger felt by the community over the bathhouse raids, people still being upset about slavery as they should be. Power is something that really, the effects of power stays with us for a long time. So that's why it's very important that when people wield power, they do so carefully. And that when we are when we're talking to other marginalized folks, we're very aware of their power and the power that we have. So we are not injuring or oppressing them further. The magnitude of power is heavily contingent on situational and social context. The impact of power tends to be measured by the emotional, psychological, and physiological and mental response to change made. So that's how we can tell how impactful power is, because there's no unit to measure power. It's not like I can take this cup and put a certain amount of power in it and say that this is what this power has done to me. This is how much I've been hurt by this amount of power, or that this amount of power is okay to wield in a certain situation. There's no way to measure that. We only measure that by the way that we react to things. So that's why it's so important to be careful with the power that we have, because it's very cause and effect. It's I'm doing something with the power that I have and it immediately affects you. There is no in-between stage where you can differentiate between what's going to happen and what has happened. We can also measure intangibles such as levels of happiness, trust, life satisfaction, and peace. Um, we there's like scales that we can use to measure or determine how happy we are, how peaceful we are as a country, and we can do the same with shame, despair, and chaos. But we can't do the same with power. There is no scale for power. Um, but a strong measure of power, the impact or influences of power in the queer community are visibility, and what passing looks like. And passing is being able to fit in the binary. So what I say that we can see how much power straight people have by how important it is for us as queer folks to pass. Like how important is it for, if I am living in a red state, if I am like, let's say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a really like rural place in York region. Like let's say if I'm in like Pefferlaw. I'm not sure if that's in York region, Ontario, I would say. Let's say I'm in Pefferlaw. Um, how important is it for me to pass? How important is it for me not to be clocked as someone who is queer? That's how much power straight people have. And it literally dictates how we live our lives. Um, and when the straight community stops using physical appearance and gender expression to measure what the queer community looks like, passing will stop being a queer standard. It's only a queer standard because we so desperately want to hold on to the power that we have. But if power wasn't so important, I don't think that queer people would marginalize other queer people and discriminate against other queer people when they don't pass as what they believe as they should be. And we do that. There are times that we do discriminate against others in the queer community. And it's important that we acknowledge that so we can start moving to change that. We're going to also talk a little bit about privilege. So privileges are the unearned advantages that someone experiences when they have something or are part of a group that has power or align closely with a norm. It's also been alluded, there's a metaphor about privilege being an invisible backpack full of tools. And it's like a backpack that you take with you to each situation, and you can pull out a tool and it helps you navigate that situation. And you haven't done anything to earn these tools. You haven't done anything to earn these advantages, but it's just because of who you are. It's just your intersections. Um, and oftentimes when we don't have privilege, our lives are on the line. Since we've been villainized and used as scapegoats since the middle of the millennium, if we don't have the privilege, for example, to pass, if as someone who is Black, I don't have the privilege of education, and I am living in society, oftentimes my life is on the line because I don't have that privilege. And sometimes in the queer community, we don't understand that privilege often dictates the way that we operate around other queer people. And that's where racism comes in and trans misogyny comes in. And it's all seen within the queer community. We're doing it within our own community. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about that and say that it's important that we recognize that so we can stop doing that. There are different levels of privilege and intersectionality, and intersectionality is a key determining factor to your level of privilege and how it manifests. For example, if you're a cis lesbian, you have less privilege than a trans man because of male privilege in one way, but that's only in one situation, in one context. And so what we need to do is we need to think of the different situations and contexts that arise for that trans man and for that cis lesbian, and how that travels and how that stays with them in each situation, and how we can leverage our own privileges based on our own intersections to ensure that they have access and they have just as much power as we can give them. the intersections that queer norms favor differ from heterosexuality, um, um, and they suggest an inherent need for perfection. And the reason I say this is because a lot of the queer norms are about lookism and being fully able-bodied and being young and being white and being fit and being perfect. And I think this is because we so desperately try to overcompensate at times, because we've internalized this idea that we are defective as a community, that we're defective as queer people, that as queer people we aren't good enough, and so we try so hard to be perfect, and we try to so hard to meet these ideals to overcompensate so we can fit in with straight people, and we don't need to do that. We can live in our own society. We can resist and live in our own in our own ways, and we don't need to compare or overcompensate for anything. Oftentimes, with immense amounts of privilege comes ignorance to understand the struggle of others with different relationships to power. And I've noticed this a lot. I'm going to tell you a little story. So I was in Ottawa for a little while, and I met this guy on Grindr for like the first time I met someone on Grindr in Ottawa. And he took me on this boat, and he was this white guy. His name was Carter. And at one point, he told me that Black people over exaggerate the pain that we feel from racism. And I was furious, and I made him drive me back to the land, and I just stormed off, and I went back to where I was staying. And that was just an example of how ignorant some people can be because they don't understand our struggle. And so what I would invite the queer folks here tonight and the allies here tonight to do is to understand the struggle of others, understand the struggle of those that we might not think are struggling as much as we are, and try to think of the amount of privilege they have and the amount of power that they have and the amount of privilege and power that we have and the ways that we can leverage those things. Folks with privilege often have stability and access to stability that marginalized folks don't due to their privilege. For example, some folks who have the privilege to pass um, have much higher rates of employment, much higher rates of um, post-secondary education. They tend to be higher stat, higher class. They tend to have better better economic positions, just because they can pass, just because they have that privilege. So some of the better benefits of privilege include better treatment, better education, approval of bank loans, promotion, lack of stress, lack of trauma. All these things come from privileges. And it's seen as the conceptual opposite of stigma. I'm just seeing how much time we have. We have about 15 minutes before the Q&A, and I just want to try to get through. How much do we have left to get through? Okay. So I'm going to jump past a few things because I realize this is quite a long PowerPoint, and we only have so much time left, and I want to leave time for the Q&A. We're going to talk a bit about stigma, because stigma is one of the things I think that affect us as queer folks the most. It is the reason why we don't get tested. It is the reason why we don't talk about being HIV positive. It's the reason why we don't. It's the reason why we don't come out when we can or when it feels comfortable to us. It's the reason why we sometimes don't date the people that we want to date. And it's all because of stigma, and it's all because we try to avoid being further stigmatized because we're so heavily stigmatized as it is, which isn't fair because we haven't done nothing wrong. Stigma is a negative social value that you're given because you engage in a particular activity, have a specific quality, or are part of a particular group of circumstance. And the rationale for that negative value comes from the fact that comes from prejudice, stereotypes, and bias, and it's tied to your lack of power. People who are heavily stigmatized often have little to no power, and the people who are powerful and are stigmatized aren't touched as heavily by stigma because they have access to resources and because they have power and because they align with norms that leave them in a position where it doesn't affect them as much. Um, so that's why it's important um, when you're interacting with another person in the queer community and you're trying to figure out like why things might not be as great for them. Look at their intersections and look at their lack of power. Look at the differences between you and that person and try to understand what prejudice and stereotypes that they might be facing that you aren't facing. We aren't all subject to the same experiences in the queer community. And so I think I just wanted to say that. Um, I've 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 gotten a lot of disdain, being someone who has experience with being a substance use and being homeless and being Black and queer. And a lot of folks in the queer community, a lot of Black folks, Black youth are homeless, and a lot of Black trans youth are homeless, and a lot of trans youth are homeless. And this is also because of the amount of stigma that they face, and the amount of prejudice and the lack of power that they have, and it's all tied together. I see another question. One second, I will get to the question. We have like 10 minutes and then I will go over both questions, one from Raven and this question that's popped up. Stigma is also intersectional and is influenced heavily by bias. Stigma acts to actively distance someone from power and shame them, which demoralizes people and has serious mental, emotional, and sometimes physical repercussions through internalization of stigma. Many issues around morality arise because of the way that stigma and shame affect the psyche, like overdose and HIV, which I already spoke about. Also, I think the reason why stigma affects us so heavily is because it's such a moral thing. When we face stigma, what we are being told is that we are bad. When we, for example, queer people who PNP, people who party and play, who use substances and have sex, they're heavily stigmatized in the queer community. There's no space in the queer community for queer guys and queer people who PNP. And that's because using substances and having kinky or piggy-like sex is seen as heavily stigmatized. And I'm not sure if this is like, I understand this is Pflag and it's also supposed to be family oriented. And so I'm going to not be too explicit. But the type of sex that we have when we PNP is heavily stigmatized, even though at the end of the day, it's still queer sex. Why is that? Why are we stigmatizing and telling people that they are wrong for doing a variation of what we do? When it's all just because we don't approve of that, because we might not like another action associated with it. It's important that we question and analyze the reasons behind why we dislike something, where does that come from, and the morality that we are assigning to it. And on a tangent, ultimately, to talk about prohibition and talk about PNP and substance use, prohibition and abstinence-based ideology came from puritanical Protestant 1700 views that came to birth around the time of colonization. The people were using substances far before people started thinking that substances were bad and that substances were wrong and immoral. So why is it now we are stigmatizing people in our own community for doing that? It doesn't make any sense. And so these are all just the different facets that ultimately come from oppression. Ultimately, stigma, a lack of power, prejudice, all of this comes from the oppression that we are facing from people who are straight, from people who are white, from people who are dominant, from people who are rich. This is all oppression that we are facing. And this is the effects of the oppression. Stigma is an effect of oppression. So ultimately, all of this is coming from the fact that we are being oppressed. And so what I want to do is, we only have 6 minutes left. We have to skip a lot. I also want to talk about queerness in Canada and the history behind it. But maybe I'll come back at another time after this series and talk about legalizing queerness in Canada and some other stuff too. But what I wanted to leave folks today with was this question. have you ever thought, like, while being hateful on Grindr, or while dealing with, or like, or while receiving hate on Grindr, maybe you're not the hateful person, but maybe you're receiving hate on Grindr, or you're in an interaction with someone and they say something racist, or they say something, and or you're trans and they say something that's trans misogynistic. Have you ever thought, what do heterosexual people gain from this interaction? Or what does a white supremacist gain from my intolerance again of my own community members? As I was saying, we're being oppressed. And one classic thing about oppression is that the people who are being oppressed, their suffering benefits the oppressor. So what is it that they're gaining from us? They're gaining from our fighting. They're gaining, our oppressors are gaining from the fact that we are intolerant and we are racist and we are homophobic against each other and we are prejudiced against each other and we're stigmatizing each other. So we need to stop and think, why are we fighting against each other when we're losing? Ultimately, we're losing. So I just wanted to leave folks with that question. And so when you have the impulse to say something that might be homophobic to someone else or FMophobic, or you might think something that's transphobic, and you're a cis hetero, you're a cis queer guy, sorry, or a cis queer woman, and you're thinking something transphobic. Before you perpetuate that oppression, think, what does a straight person gain from this? Because they gain permission. They gain validation that what they believe about us is true. They gain the okay to further oppress us when we oppress other people within our own community. So we give them a pass when we oppress others in our own community. So I think it's important that we stop when we start to oppress others in our own community, and we think, what are other people gaining from that? Because we're losing. I want to go to the Q&A and spend some time on that quickly. We have 20 minutes, so I think that's a good enough time to go through the questions. And I invite the participants to talk to me. Like, let's talk about these questions and let's talk about what comes up. Okay. Okay, so it was a continuation of the first question. All right, so let's spend some time on this. And then after, if we have more time, we can go back. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can fiddle with this question. All right. There we go. Now I can see the Q&A properly. All right, perfect. So we're going to start with Raven's first question. Raven asked, does power and safety also affect queer oppression in a multitude of intersectional ways? I think that, does power and safety affect queer oppression in a multitude of intersectional ways? I mean, of course, power and safety affect queer oppression. I think that we are oppressed and we are always unsafe when we don't have power. And the amount of power that we have very much heavily is related to how safe we are. And I think I said that actually earlier in the slide. And that it's the same thing for folks who are trans. A lot of transgender folks, their safety is very much heavily dependent on how visible they are and how much power they have, and visibility and power and safety for them as well are heavily intertwined. So I think that is like the key component to knowing if we're safe as queer people is if we have power as queer people is how safe we are. I also invite you folks to maybe share how the way that you feel about power and safety. And what does safety and power look like for you in your lives? For me, I know that I feel safe and I feel powerful when I am angry, and when I can channel that anger. And I know that I have privilege as someone who is male passing, but as someone who is Black, my body is seen as something that's hostile. And so what I do is I invert that typical narrative of me being a hostile Black person, and I own that power. And I take that back and I reclaim that idea that I am a dangerous person, and I convert that into personal power. So that's how I try to flip that lack of power that I have, knowing that at any point in time I can be hurt because I am Black. And so that's the way that I personally try to empower myself through my Blackness, is trying to, like, by reclaiming the ways that I'm feeling through that oppression and claiming that as safety. Or even also ask, what about trans men who don't have male privilege? It's true, there are trans men who don't have male privilege and who still have to deal with worrying about whether or not they're passing as men or whether or not they're safe as being clocked as women. As the women they're not, that is that's brutal. I personally can't, one second, I'm gonna finish reading. I feel that there's still a lot of hatred towards trans men. Speaking as a autistic, trans, mask, multi-gender, white passing Russian Jew, who's reading online experiences of specific hatred against trans men and trans masks. I'm really sorry that that's happening. That must be really heavy to deal with. And I'm agender, I'm not a trans man, so I can't understand how heavy that is for you to hold. And I'm sorry that that's the experiences that you're having, and that's also the experiences that our community members are having. And I'm genuinely sick and tired of people thinking that one marginalized group in a community is somehow more privileged than another, because oppression affects people in a multitude of ways. It's not that. I don't think some of us are more privileged, yes, Raven, but I also think that we're just privileged in different ways as well, and that it looks different in different situations. And it doesn't mean that trans men who are being clocked, even though they're not women, don't have privilege. I'm not saying that that they don't have privilege. They might have privilege. They might not have privilege, depending on their intersections. And this is only privilege in comparison to someone else. That's the only reason only when we are talking about being we're relating to others, do we need to talk about privilege. If we were in a vacuum, privilege would be irrelevant. But only because we live in society and we have to live with oppression is privilege important. And I'm not sure, like, and I'm also not going to speak of, yeah, for sure, Tristan, go ahead.
I was going to mention, one point that really stuck out to me, and I think relates to what we're talking about here in this moment too, is when we think about those levels of oppression that, or not oppression, of privilege that people wield around us, we tend to also give that power to them when we're also, in a way, kind of reflecting on how we measure up to that privilege, and where we view our own, where we kind of set ourselves up on that hierarchy. And we really have to empower ourselves to not compare ourselves to one another, in the community, but rather, and that's a way of taking back that power and taking back that idea that someone is maybe more privileged than you or more powerful than you, and wielding that in your own way.
100%, I totally agree. Thank you, Tristan, for that. Reclamation is our weapon. Reclamation and resistance are our weapons, and we have them at our disposal and we can use them. And we definitely should use them as much as we can.
And of course, easier said than done as well. But
Sure, sure.
it's that, if there's something that I'm taking away from tonight, it's that to remember that in everywhere that I go, because that's the key to bringing that own self-love and confidence with you in every space that you go into. And there are so many different things that weigh us down and depending on our lived experiences and what we're experiencing in our intersections. But in trying to hold that, you can wield as much power as you possibly can, and for yourself. And in that moment, that can, it can really be endless in a way for some folks, and can be life-saving in certain moments as well.
For sure, for sure. I definitely agree. And like, there are definitely moments where I felt so powerless, and I've tapped into feeling my own power, and I felt so rejuvenated and so nourished when I've been feeling like I've been lacking community. And Raven, I'm not sure where do you get your power from, and where do you how do you draw from your power, and how do you draw from your intersections? I'm reflecting this back at you. um yeah, Raven, please share.
I think they'll only have access to the chat there, so it might take them a little bit to.
Oh, okay, for sure, we'll wait.
But if anyone else does have any questions as well, please feel free to share that too. We have a few more minutes left with Akia as well.
Yes, Raven, I see your hand. I'm just keeping an eye out for a message. So feel free to message in the chat or message on the Q&A, whatever feels comfortable for you, to let us know what you're thinking, how you're feeling. And if anyone else wants to comment, if it's comfortable for Raven, just give us a thumbs up, or like an okay, or like a cool or something, so we know that like other folks can comment on your share, and we can open up the conversation further.
We we are just a reminder to everyone, we are recording this as a webinar. It's not being streamed live or anything, but we do want to protect everyone as much as possible. So we don't want to bring your video on. We don't want your voice to be heard, vocally, not because we don't want to hear you, but because we just want to better protect you, as this will go out to our YouTube channel just for others to be able to take in the content if they couldn't join us tonight.
Also just see someone, I just saw a name that stuff it looks familiar. Hi. I'm not sure. Can I say the name? Can I say like, can I do a little shout out? Is that okay?
Maybe if you want to type it in the chat, like type their name in and then be like,
Yeah,
ah,
we'll do that.
yeah. That's okay. But I think in the meantime, just in case we're waiting for any chats or questions to come in, Akia, if we can maybe reflect on how these ideas of power, of stigma, of oppression might tie into our upcoming topics with PrEP and with party and play, and kind of what the narrative that we're starting to create in between all three of these topics.
For sure. So when it comes to PrEP, there has been a hierarchy that's been created around people who are on PrEP, people who aren't on PrEP, people who are still using condoms, people who don't use condoms and who aren't on PrEP. And a lot of people are starting to stigmatize other people who they're having sex with about their PrEP usage. And so it's starting to change the way that people are hooking up, the way that people are talking to other people on dating apps, the way that people are associating with other people in non-sexual situations. All of this is just coming from if they use PrEP or if they don't use PrEP. People are making decisions about who people are morally, like as people, based on what they're putting in their body and how they're choosing to have sex. So that's wild to me. That blows my mind, because I'm like, that's none of your business. So that's one. And then PMP we're going to talk about, which stands for Party and Play, as I mentioned before. It's when queer folks, typically queer men, but not only queer men, people who are not queer also like use drugs and have sex, but it's typically known for by gay men. And it's typically about like with the crystal meth usage and GHB usage and rougher, can be kinkier forms of sex. And it's heavily stigmatized. And I'm going to pause and someone else, an anonymous attendee, commented, and I'd like to share. They said, for me, I get my power from being, or maybe it's Raven, I'm not sure. For me, I get my power from being with supportive people online who truly understand me as a guy, curating my online experiences away from femininity content that makes me feel dysphoric, along with anything that is both neuronormative. I love neuronormative. Yes, neuronormative, such a good word. And cis heteronormative for myself. I love that word. Um, it's a word that I barely ever see, and like I'm a non-neurotypical, and so like it's just I barely ever see the neuronormative, so it's just yeah. But also for me, who has white privilege and needs to unpack a lot of stuff, including my own internalized transphobia and ableism towards others and myself. Be kind and gentle with yourself while you're unpacking that stuff. That stuff is heavy and it's also not your fault. To continue reading the lived experiences of other people so I can better understand and to validate my own conversations surrounding race and queerness. I commend you for doing all of that work. And I'm glad that you get your power from, you're drawing your power from community. Um, and I just say good on you for doing that work. You're making sure that you're not hurting and oppressing other people who are in your circle and in your community. And that's the way to progress. And that's the way to loving your community, is to making sure that you don't hurt them, right? So I think that's a beautiful thing. So thank you for sharing. And if that was Raven, thank you, Raven, for sharing. And if that was not Raven, thank you, whoever shared. Um, so to finish off what I was saying earlier, folks who PMP are heavily stigmatized because they use substances, and substance use is heavily stigmatized. And so it's more stigmatized sometimes depending on who you are, and if you're a person of color, if you're not a person of color, if you're someone who's rich and doing it, it's seen as differently as someone is if you're someone doing it in like a bathhouse and you're poor and you're smoking meth. Like people view the substance that you use and where you are in life very differently, and they judge you based on that. And it varies depending on your intersections and what you're using and who you're using and where you're using it with and what you look like. And so for some people, it's totally okay. It's like, oh, they're a girl, they're just out in the town, they're just having a good night. And for others, it's totally taboo and off the table. So it's very interesting the way that stigma and oppression and prejudice play a role in the type of sex that we have, and how we engage in having sex with substances. So I'm also going to be talking about that in the upcoming series as well. And I also wanted to note that in general, I think the reason why we so heavily stigmatize the way that we are having sex and love each other is based off of this whole idea that straight people have come up with, that we're deviants. I think that we've internalized that heavily as a community, and that it's really done something really like horrible to the way that we function. And it goes back to this whole idea of us grooming and as people who are perverse and trying to corrupt children and trying to push an agenda. And it goes back to that idea that we are in error and we're erroneous and that we are wrong. So that's why I like to explore the ways that it shows up in different arenas, including sex. So that's what the series is about. And thank you everyone for coming and listening to me ramble for a bit. Oh, Raven, thank you. I wrote the analysis. Thank you, Raven. I'm doing the best that I can to aid both myself and to recharge my batteries, because I'm the kind of autistic person who puts more batteries in others than to themselves. And I may need to learn how to continue to balance this. It's a hard one, but you're a wonderful person for being that type of person. And to be able to fully listen to others, also to sit with my own discomfort and to call out any uncomfortable, bigoted thoughts my brain comes up with. Thank you for tonight, Akia, and I hope that tomorrow is more kinder to you and that you are with supportive, caring, understanding people who uplift you and are the ones who you can lean on when the world takes you out. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Oh, make me want to cry. Thank you so much for your kindness, and I feel very held in this circle, in this space tonight. So I also want to thank Tristan and Pflag for allowing me to come and say my few words, do my thing, and well, a little bit more than a few words actually, and just to share space with you folks. So thank you so much, and I will leave it to Tristan to close out the coffee night.
Well, no, thank you for joining us, and thank you for holding us through this discussion. It's an incredibly, heavy discussion to have because it can bring up so many feelings and memories of individuals. I was certainly feeling that way as you were taking us through the discussion, as I'm sure you may have been as well, just in trying to guide us through this discussion, and everyone else here. And just thank you so much for your time and for leading us through such a difficult topic. But I think it creates a really great foundation for our upcoming topics, and hope that everyone is able to join us over the next little bit. I encourage everyone here today. I know one person might be well connected with Care Community Connections, but I encourage everyone to get well connected with Care Community Connections and the services that they offer, and just the many, many great events they hold. We put up as many posters as possible as we can get on our website, and direct folks to Care's social media as well, just to discover everything that is happening in York Region. It's not just us, it's Care, it's many different organizations that are trying to offer as much as possible to our queer York Region residents and allies. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a great evening.
Bye, folks. Thank you.